It was a war the world refused to see fought in silence, in shadows, and in the name of freedom. A brutal, hidden conflict that would decide the fate of a nation and send shockwaves across the African continent. This is the story of the secret war that ended white rule in southern Africa, the Rhodesian Bush War. Our story begins in the 1890s when Rhodesia, known today as Zimbabwe, was colonized by Britain. Under the influence of Cecil Rhodes and his British South Africa Company, vast tracts of land were seized from black Africans and handed over to a small minority of white settlers. This created a system of racial segregation mirroring South Africa's apartheid. By the 1960s, 250,000 white settlers held absolute power over 5 million black Africans who were denied basic rights like voting and land ownership. But the winds of change were blowing across Africa. Inspired by independence movements in Ghana, Kenya, and beyond, a new wave of African nationalism was rising. The struggle began peacefully, with petitions and protests, but the white minority government responded with harsh repression, pushing the nationalist leaders to a radical conclusion. Freedom would have to be won through armed struggle. By the early 1960s, the nationalist movement had split into two main factions. There was ZANU, the Zimbabwe African National Union, primarily representing the Shona people and eventually led by Robert Mugabe. And there was ZAPU, the Zimbabwe African People's Union, mostly Nebel, led by Joshua Nkomo. As the struggle intensified, they formed their military wings. ZANU's army, ZANLA, received backing from China and operated from bases in Mozambique. ZAPU's military wing, ZIPRA, was supported by the Soviet Union and based in Zambia. These two armies, born from a shared dream of liberation, were about to launch a guerrilla war against one of the most well-equipped armies in Africa. This conflict became known as the Bush War. Faced with growing pressure from Britain to grant rights to the black majority, Rhodesia's white government made a defiant move. On November 11, 1965, Prime Minister Ian Smith unilaterally declared independence from Britain. He famously claimed, "We have struck a blow for the preservation of justice, civilization, and Christianity in Africa." This unilateral declaration of independence, or UDI, was a desperate attempt to preserve white minority rule indefinitely. No country in the world officially recognized Rhodesia. The United Nations imposed economic sanctions, aiming to cripple the rogue state. Yet, Smith's regime survived. It received quiet support from apartheid South Africa and, at the time, Portuguese-controlled Mozambique and Angola. Western corporations often looked the other way, allowing Rhodesia to defy the world for over a decade. The UDI drew a line in the sand, making a full-blown war inevitable. The first few years of the war, from 1966 to 1972, were a harsh learning curve for the guerrilla fighters. ZANLA and ZIPRA launched small-scale incursions from across the border, targeting symbols of the state, remote farms, police stations, and railway lines. Their goal was to mobilize the rural population, winning the support of peasants who had lost their land. The Rhodesian security forces, highly trained and well-armed, responded with brutal efficiency. They launched aggressive counter-insurgency operations, destroying villages suspected of harboring freedom fighters and creating a climate of fear. This wasn't a war of conventional battles, but of ambushes, intelligence gathering, and propaganda. It was a fight for the hearts and minds of the people, waged in the vast, unforgiving African bush. Then, in 1975, the entire strategic map of southern Africa changed. A revolution in Portugal led to the collapse of its colonial empire. Mozambique and Angola became independent nations. For Rhodesia, this was a catastrophic development. The newly independent Mozambique, led by the Frelimo government, was a firm ally of ZANU. It offered Zanla a massive, secure border to launch attacks and ferry supplies. Suddenly, Ian Smith's government was surrounded by hostile states committed to its downfall. ZANLA now had safe havens right on Rhodesia's doorstep, while ZIPRA continued to operate from Zambia with Soviet and East German support. The secret war was about to explode. With new bases and a flood of recruits, the guerrilla war intensified dramatically from 1976 onwards. Zanla and ZIPRA launched coordinated large-scale attacks, penetrating deep into the heart of Rhodesia. They promised villagers land reform and an end to oppression, slowly winning the loyalty of the rural population. The Rhodesian military, now bolstered by South African advisors and international mercenaries, fought back with ferocious cross-border raids into Mozambique and Zambia, attacking guerrilla camps and villages alike. The war became increasingly brutal. Atrocities were committed on all sides, with massacres, forced relocations into protected villages, and psychological warfare becoming commonplace. Over the next few years, the conflict would claim more than 30,000 lives, the vast majority of them civilians caught in the crossfire. By the late 1970s, the writing was on the wall for the Smith regime. The constant warfare was draining the economy, and the morale of the white population was cracking under the strain of sanctions and military call-ups. Internationally, Rhodesia was completely isolated. The Organization of African Unity and the United Nations condemned the illegal regime, and even its Western allies, the U.S. and Britain, began to push for a settlement. They feared that a prolonged war would drive the entire region into the Soviet sphere of influence. The pressure from all sides, military, economic, and diplomatic, was becoming unbearable. The end was near. In a final diplomatic push, all parties were brought to the negotiating table in London. In 1979, these crucial talks became known as the Lancaster House Conference. For 3 long months, British mediators brokered a deal between the Rhodesian government, led by Ian Smith and his moderate black allies, and the guerrilla leaders Robert Mugabe and Joshua Nkomo. The atmosphere was tense, with decades of hatred and mistrust filling the room. But against all odds, they reached a groundbreaking agreement: a ceasefire, a new constitution guaranteeing majority rule, and internationally supervised elections. On December 12, 1979, the Rhodesian flag was lowered, and for a brief period, the country returned to British colonial status to oversee the transition to peace. In February 1980, the people of Rhodesia voted for their future. The election resulted in a landslide victory for Robert Mugabe's ZANU-PF party. The moment the world had said was impossible had finally arrived. On April 18, 1980, the Union Jack was lowered for the last time. In its place, the new flag of Zimbabwe was raised. The new Prime Minister, Robert Mugabe, stood beside Prince Charles as a new nation was born, marking the end of nearly a century of white minority rule. Freedom had been won, but the cost was immense. Tens of thousands were dead, millions had been displaced, and the nation remained deeply scarred by the political and ethnic divisions of the war. The Rhodesian Bush War was more than just a fight for independence. It was a Cold War proxy battle, a struggle against racial ideology, and a powerful testament to African determination. It brought an end to white rule in Rhodesia and became a beacon of inspiration for liberation movements in neighboring Namibia and South Africa. But its legacy is complex. The trauma of the war and the political fractures it created continue to echo in Zimbabwe today. It remains a little-known chapter in modern history, a secret war where African fighters, against all odds, rewrote their own destiny, while much of the world simply looked away. Thank you for watching. If you found this story compelling, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more hidden histories from around the world. See you next time.